Thanks so much. A warm welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm so glad you could join us for this very brief sort of snapshot on one particular theme. Brett, I think you have the PowerPoint presentation. That's great. Before we get into this specific theme, which is going to be the UN human rights and the accountability movement or the accountability crisis, just a bit of a background into the course. The last few years, the intention has been to talk about the origin story of the UN from a human rights perspective, back to the Universal Declaration, the UN Charter, and fast forwarding to today. So all these big concepts that we see in the human rights movement, where are they in 2023? And that could be human rights and counterterrorism, human rights and gender, human rights and climate change. And the course is big on an operational perspective. So yes, it's transferring knowledge to you about conceptually what are these big themes, how were they generated. But I think one of the big takeaways I hope for the class for the last few years has been a deep operational perspective. So when theory meets practice, what happens? In all of those themes, we have sort of 6 themes that we run through, and it includes a series of guest speakers from the UN who have an operational perspective in those themes that I mentioned to you. So I think this is one of the added values of this course is if you're thinking of moving into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or an international organization like the UN, the course wants to give you sort of a real life experience. What is it like working with a senior UN official when you're tasked to join him or her and brief the Secretary General on human rights accountability in Xinjiang in China and the treatment of the Uyghurs? You got 15 minutes to put together a briefing note, because if this is the space you wish to come into, that's going to be a daily activity for you. So this course sort of prepares you for that. So it's and you could be working for the political office, the human rights office, or ministry, or an NGO. Okay, thanks. That's a bit of background. The foreground today is a major theme that has been with the UN for years, as you know, since World War II. It's part of the origin story of the UN, which is addressing, preventing, mitigating issues around atrocities, accountability for atrocities around the killing of civilians. How can this be prevented? And also, how can it be punished? We look, first of all, about the theoretical underpinnings to atrocity prevention, sort of the key core documents. That's obviously the UN Charter. The Declaration has no legal status, but the UN Charter has more authority, more power, as do the sort of what's called the treaty system. And the session, which would last over 2 days, in this case is Tuesdays and Thursdays, about 6 hours altogether, would explore the historical and then the current efforts around addressing atrocity crimes. And as you know, the crisis has been long-standing. There's been a series of major events followed by major reports, followed by major action by the UN machinery, political machinery. That's the UN Security Council, the Human Rights Council, to prevent, to punish. And we'll explore that arc, which really begins in the mid-90s. Next slide. So the origin story is, if you may remember or not, this phrase, no more Rwandas. So genocide took place in Rwanda in the mid-90s. Millions of civilians were killed, hundreds of thousands suffered sexual violence. And there was a call by the international community, particularly the Secretary General at the time, in 1999, should say, is Kofi Annan, which is no more Rwanda. So the international community needs to rally support to stop the killing of civilians. And as you know, it was not only Rwanda, it was also in the Balkans, in Bosnia, Croatia, and where I began my sort of first gig as a lawyer with the UN in Kosovo in 1999. It also was in Kosovo. And there was a big push to do something must be done by the UN system. And that was forced by a series of reports, 2 major reports on Bosnia and Rwanda, that resulted in the Secretary General coming out with a major announcement in the late 90s. Just to stop there, you haven't read the reports, but the report in Rwanda basically blamed the leadership of the peacekeeping operation in the UN that was led by Kofi Annan. So I think there was a sense he felt a lot of guilt that he himself when he heard about the potential killings in Rwanda, had not notified the Secretary General at the time, had not notified the UN Security Council or anyone else in leadership at the time. So I think he felt a lot of responsibility for not have sort of notified the relevant machinery to do something. The consequence was in 1999, he issued an op-ed piece that said there's something called two sovereignties, that we needed to move away from the concept of sovereignty, which is, it's state sovereignty. Whatever happens within the borders of your state, it's a matter for you. He said there's basically two concepts. And the second concept is sort of person sovereignty, your individual sovereignty, more to human rights. And that if there were circumstances in which a state was killing its own civilians, that there was an obligation on the international community to what's called pierce state sovereignty. And in some instances, use force to remove that government from power. This generated a lot of support. At the time, it was called humanitarian intervention. That had a lot of sort of pushback, I think, from many, particularly in the global South. It then transformed into something else. And if we can go to the next slide, colleagues. So a series of these big reports about humanitarian intervention, Kosovo, Rwanda, and gained a new name called the Responsibility to Protect. The document in 2001 was funded by my Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that outcome report suggested sort of a pathway. If we do need to pierce state sovereignty, go in, use force, remove a regime from power to protect civilians because they're killing civilians. And the scale is quite serious. It's an atrocity crime, so genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Then there's these conditions that we need to first of all go through. Is there a consensus in the Security Council? Does the Security Council matter? Is that the final or the only body to speak to these issues about piercing state sovereignty? That was transitioned into what's called a famous 2005 document where the UN got together and issued a consensus report called the World Outcome Document. It's 120 pages. It's got 178 paragraphs. 2 paragraphs refer to this R2P, responsibility to protect. Namely, in some certain circumstances, you can pierce state sovereignty. That was picked up again in 2009 by the Secretary General, who laid out the framework. It's called the pillars, the 3 pillars. And the most important thing, I think, for us is what's called Pillar 3, which is there may be circumstances in which we can collectively act through the UN Security Council and go in and remove the power that's killing civilians. Next slide. So before I get to the crisis, what's interesting is that you have an individual in the form of the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, in 1989, himself with a strong opinion about what sovereignty should be. To be fair, of course, the question as to what sovereignty amounts to, the contours, the contents to sovereignty, you may think is a matter for states, not a matter for one person. Albeit the Secretary General, he's just a civil servant, right, working for an organization. So it's always been a puzzle to me as to why this sort of conversation as to sovereignty sort of became sort of expandable and everyone could pile in. So NGOs were saying this is what sovereignty is and all the rest of it. I come from a more classical school of international law that really states should be determining sovereignty and the contours there too. But anyway, it became quite flexible, sovereignty. And the consequence was a commitment by some member states, I would say not all, to piercing state sovereignty. A lot of it, so that 2001, 2009, a lot of interest, a lot of noise. And then Libya happened, which is where, in essence, the US and its allies pushed through the Security Council a resolution to allow for force, deadly force. If you may remember, in Libya, there were civilians in Benghazi who were under immediate threat of being attacked by Gaddafi and his forces. The US asked the council to give them permission to use force to protect civilians. And the Security Council members were very cautious about this. But in essence, the approval from the UN Security Council, importantly, Russia and China, Germany abstained, was that don't go beyond protecting civilians. So don't arm the rebels, don't provide them funding, which is what happened. And the consequence, as you know, was that Gaddafi was killed. R2P, the responsibility to protect, the concept blew up completely. And it's almost 2012, 2020, 21. You may remember the Syria crisis blew up in 2011. And what's quite striking is that the Security Council has not mentioned R2P, I'd say in almost a decade. It comes in now and again in the on report from the Secretary General's colleagues, what's called SG reports to the Council, but no member state has raised the R2P flag in Syria, in Myanmar, in Tigray, Ethiopia, in Belarus, in Venezuela. Ironically, if you follow the news, of course, it was Russia that raised R2P in the context of the need to protect civilians in the Donbass and Crimea. This is in the context of Ukraine. But for all intents and purposes, R2P appears to be dead. I call it dead but toxic, because, of course, many global South states are afraid to hear that term because it just means one thing: removing authorities from power. Next slide, please. So that's something the class explores. So now what? If this is off the table, piercing state sovereignty, how do we, as an international community, sort of rally support around the protection of civilians in Xinjiang, in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, in Serbia, in the east of Ukraine, and then Venezuela, and beyond? You know, what are the tools that's left? So if we can't go in, if we've decided, and it may well be that the class, because we explored this last year, whether or not the class may think there's a need to regenerate, like Lazarus, it should rise from the ashes, R2P. Is there a case for the resurrection of R2P or not? And if not, what are the tools does the international community have to protect civilians and punish perpetrators? Next question. Next slide, sir. So a ton of activities, knowledge generation activities that we have in the class. These are just some examples. One is sort of the speed research, which is a lot of fun. I just need to move my slide here, sorry. You got 5 minutes. Go away and explore however you wish. And you can Google what today is the most effective tool at preventing atrocities, so preventing genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Off you go. 5 minutes, and then students come back with their own their research findings. And what's fascinating is if you have a class of 15, you often have found, my experience, you have 15 different perspectives about effective tools. So students have gone to different sources of material on the internet to get an answer to that question. A lot of activities around breakout groups in my class, which I think is really fun, asking the questions you see here. If the UN human rights machinery has a role in prevention, protection, and punishing atrocity crimes, which part of the UN human rights machinery is that? Of course, it raises a threshold question. What is the UN human rights machinery? Because it's the Security Council. It could be the General Assembly. It could be the Human Rights Council. It could be the Secretary General in his good office's role. It could be the High Commissioner for Human Rights in his or her role. It could be the office, UN Human Rights Office. They're all currently playing a role, but which moving part of the machinery is most effective? And as you see, another question is the legacy of R2P, something I just raised briefly. Right? You may think there's a case to resurrect R2P. I think you have a long way to go. I think it's difficult to come up with a compelling case for it. But on the other hand, we have Syria, we have Myanmar, we have Xinjiang, and all the rest of it, Venezuela. So what more can be done? We're not throwing up our hands. There's an international commitment around the prevention and punishment of atrocity crimes. But if R2P is off the table, then you need to sort of workshop together as to what's most politically feasible, politically digestible in the atrocity prevention, protection, punishment space. Next slide. So that's an incredibly brief snapshot of a really, really critical area. As you know, it's in the media every day. One thing we do in the class, by the way, is we begin the class with, if we're looking at, say, climate justice and human rights, what's an important media story that you're reading this week? The same goes for the other sort of 5 topics as well. But anyway, thanks so much for your time. And Brett, back to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Marshall. It's always so interesting to hear about the work that you do and just an overarching story of the UN and the role that they play in kind of overseeing the safety of the world. Um, I did want to kind of start off with a couple of questions from my end, if you don't mind, and then kind of pass it over to any questions that the audience may have from their end for the next 5 or 10 minutes. If you wouldn't mind kind of walking us through kind of what your professional journey from law school to working for Canada Foreign Affairs, currently teaching at Columbia, kind of what that journey was like, and if you have any sort of advice to anyone who is kind of looking to have a similar path that you've walked.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I'll begin by saying that if your motivation is to move into this space, you need to sort of add what I call tools to your value toolbox. You need to bring value to the UN. The UN is not an entry level and should not be an entry level job, because you are going to meet the Chief Justice in Kabul, in Baghdad, in Khartoum, in Juba, and I met them all. And if you're going to meet the Chief Justices in those countries, you need to have a depth of expertise, a depth of knowledge. Ideally, you can speak in their language as well. So that's what I think I did. So just quickly, in high school, I was a member of Amnesty International. I've always had a deep interest in issues around injustice and the criminal justice system. So I did a lot of writing letters on behalf of prisoners of conscience around the world. And then became a lawyer. My work was predominantly defense work, but I became a consultant to Amnesty on U.S. criminal justice issues, death penalty, use of force, jail conditions. And then I did that for 15 years. So my legal practice then moved into death penalty work. So I worked in the South, in Texas and Louisiana, representing persons on death row, but was still involved in like the international human rights space. And then was asked to become the legal advisor in the field in Kosovo after the NATO bombing in 1999, and was there for 2 years. And then became the criminal procedure advisor to the UN Human Rights Office, and then the law and policy advisor and the justice advisor in the UN. And then, as you've heard, moved to the foreign ministry as the justice advisor. So it's interesting for me is that my path has been, I think, linear, because my motivations have remained the same. My motivations have been predominantly around injustice in the criminal justice system. So that began sort of in the national space, but then moved into sort of the international space. So it was sort of a natural progression to move into addressing accountability. So part of my job now is how do we help Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office investigate and prosecute killings, including sexual violence. But so that it just makes sense, right? From law school, my legal practice, my work in the human rights space. And I took that experience of some 15, 16 years. So I wasn't hired by the UN until I had 15 years in my so-called toolbox. So I think I could bring some value to a discussion on the international level around reforming justice systems and addressing inequity in the justice system. So back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it takes a lot of work, which makes sense. Could you speak to kind of what excites you day to day in your work, both within the field, but also within academia, teaching in a classroom, about kind of the theory of the role of the UN?
Yeah. No, that's a really great question. So as I kind of opened the discussion today, is I think one of the benefits of the class is it's about theory meets practice. So how theory informs practice and how practice informs theory. So it's really, really critical to me that there's a ton of conceptual work done at the UN, a huge, big pushes on women, peace, and security, and other big themes. But what happens when those principles hit the ground? What are the consequences? What is the outcome? And how do we prepare for that? And that's been my work in the field. I've been working in the field for many years and exploring, as I said, how theory informs practice and practice informs theory. So that's a major part of my class, because I think it's really critical for students who, if they wanted to move into this space with their tools, their amazing tools in their toolbox, that they have no rose-tinted perspective about how it's going to be working in a so-called field. And that's what motivates, and answer your question about motivation today is so, for example, Canada funded the investigation into events in Ethiopia in 2021. I then went to Addis, the capital of Ethiopia, to meet the investigation team after they had finished their investigations to find out how it worked. Did it work well? And so if it didn't work well, why? So I'm doing a lot of that, like a lot of knowledge generation over the things that we fund. So we fund investigations in Belarus, Ukraine, Venezuela, on and on and on. And I'm intrigued about the knowledge that this generates, so we can improve future funding activities, programming activities in this space, with Canada as a major funder in the accountability space. But I want us to do so like appropriately informed about what worked and why, and what didn't work and why.
Absolutely, thank you. One question that came in, which may be a bit of a difficult question to answer within the span of a minute or two, but you had mentioned that Russia kind of referenced R2P in terms of Crimea and Ukraine, maybe to their own advantage over the UN's altruistic role. How do you feel that the UN works to make sure that all of the voices within the United Nations is actually working towards the betterment of society?
No, thank you. I love that question, because I should have mentioned at the outset, I also, the class is, it's critical we have some diversity of opinion in this space. This is the UN, the human rights space. So interestingly enough, we brought in last year a Russian diplomat in New York who works, he's in the Security Council, he's number 2 for the Russian delegation in New York. And it was tough around whether we should invite him, but I wanted to hear from a Russian perspective, like, what the hell are you doing in Ukraine and elsewhere? And, Russia's perspective is the perspective of China and some others, India, is that the Security Council has no role to talk about human rights. That's for the Human Rights Council, and that's it. It's not a forum. But when you look at the UN Security Council's discussion of a bevy of issues, whether it's counterterrorism or climate change or WPS or the rights of children, it's all more to human rights promotion and protection. So it's a bit of a strange answer, but so it's I definitely feel really strongly about a diversity of opinions on all of these themes that we have. I just don't want it to be, if I may say so, the perspectives of what I would call the liberal elites, I include myself in that characterization. Because the work that you do in the field, if you travel around the world and do this field work, is you realize that there's different perspectives about human rights, about should there be a categorization of human rights, or political rights have primacy over economic, social, cultural rights. In some instances, you'll hear yes, and some no. The West, as you know, has had a very strong push to political and civil rights for decades. This is not the perspective of many global South countries. So we explore those dynamics as well, about the ranking of rights, should there be a ranking, and all the rest of it, and why there's less attention to something like climate change in the Security Council. There's a big pushback by certain member states around climate change and human rights in the Council. So yeah, diversity of opinion, viewpoint diversity is critical, I think, for me in this class.
Absolutely. I'm just reading through a couple questions. Just one second. So one great question says, or is asking, when dealing with other countries who may be kind of coming to the table with varying points of view, as you would imagine, how do you help change policies with an open mind towards anyone else's beliefs without necessarily having to force those opinions upon them?
This comes up in the context of the rule of law movement. I call it the rule of law industry. So there's been a campaign for decades to, particularly for the US and Canada and the UK, to sort of just transport around the world rule of law. If you only have the rule of law, you're good to go. But what is it? What is this term, the rule of law? It doesn't have magical powers. And of course, the answer is no. The rule of law in Canada is not the same thing as the rule of law in Brazil. The rule of law in Brazil is not the same thing as the rule of law in Poland. Everything is moored to context, social norm development, culture, history, language, which means that one has to move incredibly with a degree of humility in this space. As the viewpoint diversity is critical, but also just humility. The international civil servant often doesn't speak the local language, doesn't understand the local context. And this explains why things have gone horribly wrong, I would suggest, to you, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Haiti, in Congo, in South Sudan, on and on and on. Just a lack of understanding. And B, I would suggest there's just too much asked of the UN. I'm talking about the UN, and that's something we discuss in the course. Sorry, what is the UN? I mean, the UN basically are member states who pay the bills. Everyone else is a civil servant. I was a civil servant. Secretary General is a civil servant. We're at their service. But they only have so much subject matter expertise. So that's something I think is interesting. There's way too much asked of the UN system. And I wonder if we should have a conversation about more being asked of regional organizations. That's ASEAN in Asia Pacific. It's the OAS for the Americas. It's the African Union. Why can't we explore passing the parcel, passing the burden to more local players who will have a deeper understanding about history, language, culture, experiences, all the rest of it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I do believe that is all of the questions that we have at this time. I will push it back to you, Professor Marshall, if you have any final thoughts you want to convey. But otherwise, thank you so much again for your lecture preview and for answering all of these questions today.
No, Brett, thanks so much. And thanks to everyone for joining. As I said at the outset, if this space interests you, you're thinking of MFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the UN system, or just international relations generally, I think it's a great course if you're thinking from a practical perspective. Yes, we'll help you out with conceptually what are these big ticket items, but how has it worked out in practice? I think it's critical for you and your professional development. So thanks so much for the invitation, Brett, to you guys, and best of luck to everyone.
Thanks, everyone.